Good morning and welcome to NeoConnect 2020. NeoConnect is NeoCon's online series of resources, programming, and events held throughout the month of June. I'm Monica DiBartolo, NeoCon's Director of Programming, and I want to thank you for joining us. Today's session is approved for 1 IDCEC credit for interior designers and 1 AILU for architects. Please refer to your screen for more details on that. So let's dive in. Today's presentation is titled Contradictions, Inclusive Design for All Generations. Our panel of design and business leaders will discuss the inherent challenges designers face when dealing with 5 generations in the workforce to provide choices of where, how, when, and with whom they work with for enhanced user experience and performance. Our experts will present generational similarities and differences, including a post-COVID-19 perspective on generational expectations of the workplace. Our panelists include Scott Phillips, Senior Director of Global Workplace Services at Salesforce in Chicago, Illinois, Christina Banks, Director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Healthy Workplaces in Berkeley, California, and Drew Jones, author of The Fifth Age of Work and founder of Open Work in Austin, Texas. They will be led in discussion by 2 NeoCon authorities, Dean Strombom and Sven Govaars. Dean Strombom is a principal at Gensler in Houston. With a career spanning almost 40 years and a portfolio of more than 40 million square feet, Dean leads the planning and design of corporate campuses, workplace interiors, and mixed-use developments. Sven Govaars is a principal at Steelcase in San Francisco. He works with business leaders and the A&D community, facilitating workplace and workforce change. His experience includes architecture, real estate, design thinking, and change management. I am delighted to turn the program over to Dean Strombom and Sven Govaars.
Good morning. And welcome to the seminar, Contradictions, Inclusive Design for All Generations. I'm Sven Govaars with Applied Research, and along with my co-moderator colleague, Dean Strombom, a principal with Gensler, we are hosting this discussion with an esteemed panel. This is our 10th NeoCon talk together, so a milestone for us. Little did we know it would be a somewhat different, some might say radical venue, quite different than being in Chicago, and that is true for all of us. Change is not always easy, yet it forms the basis for learning and growth. In previous presentations, Dean and I would go back and forth on a topic, show a few humorous videos, cite research, and come up with a couple takeaway themes. That approach no longer seemed relevant as we are in a different situation and a different time amid this health crisis, still without much sense of when and to what degree it will be considered over. Yet we still have work environments to design, clients to advise, and projects to build. What is unique today is that instead of our talking at a seminar as if we were guiding or advising others, sometimes without much sense of what may be happening in their companies, we are all going through this, and our experiences are real. We cannot shy away from hard questions. Our companies are grappling with this just as you are. We are truly in solution, paving the road as we walk on it. The time once afforded to analyze and come to the same conclusion has been collapsed. So Dean and I brainstormed, and we decided that this was still an important topic, maybe even more relevant than 3 to 4 months ago. At the same time, we didn't feel we were able to address the complexity of the topic alone. So we reached out to 3 colleagues. They are experts, and each has a unique perspective. Listening to their conversations will be enlightening, inspiring, and hopeful. We cannot generalize about generations. Discussions across generations are both research and situational, encompassing life stage influences, parental nurturing, family conditions, culture, seminal events we experience, social, political, economic, religious, or spiritual, and now a health crisis. Today, almost everyone has experienced working from home, or at least being home for an extended period. Now reentry is upon us. Generations illustrate their own contradictions in diversity, inclusiveness, and equity with respect to workplace design. But I'm getting ahead of the panel. We will have each panelist introduce themselves and say a few words about multiple generations in the workforce and the impact they see on workplace design. Dean will then provide some context based on research and surveys we have analyzed to set the stage for the panel discussion. Scott Phillips is head of occupancy planning and workplace strategy for Salesforce, and his change enablement team is in the middle of reentry in different countries, including the US, so he's right in the middle of the game. While Christina Banks comes from academia, teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, and runs the Interdisciplinary Center for Healthy Workplaces, grappling with new research to understand how the current climate is changing our views of workplace design. And Drew Jones heads up the consultancy Open Work and is a pioneer of co-working, having written I'm Out of Here in the early years and the author of The Fifth Age of Work, with a recent article exploring what this crisis means to third places such as co-working spaces. Scott, would you please start us off?
Great, thanks, Sven, and thanks for the opportunity to join the conversation this morning. So as Sven mentioned, I'm Scott Phillips, and I lead our occupancy planning and workplace strategy group at Salesforce. And in addition to that role, my team is responsible for our real estate change enablement across the company. And prior to COVID-19, we were focused on really how do we make the most efficient use of our real estate? How do we handle the growth that we're experiencing? And how do we do that using a shared seating model as we were looking to implement even more broadly across the company with 58% of our global employees already doing some level of sharing. And so obviously when COVID-19 hit, reflect back to March, we very quickly pivoted to not only closing our offices, but then how do we think about the reopening process? And so obviously our focus has changed since that time. We're now spending the last several weeks thinking really about how do we return to the workplace safely? How do we make our employees comfortable in that process? How do we make them feel confident in being able to return? And how do we create a compelling reason for why they want to return, as obviously a number of our employees are engaged in being productive working from home. And then how do we offer a very diverse global portfolio that includes 160 locations and also a very diverse generational profile of our employees. So that's some of the things that we've been working on over the last several weeks. Christina?
Thanks, Scott. Hello, everybody, and thank you to all of you to be together today to talk about this incredibly important topic. I'm Christina Banks, and I'm a faculty member in the Haas Business School at Berkeley, and also I run the research center that is designed to aggregate all known science across disciplines in order to understand how to create healthy workplaces and how to create workplaces in the future that allow them to do their best work. So before COVID came on the scene, we were concerned about how to create healthy workplaces. What would enable people to have a work experience that really improved not only their ability to work effectively, but also to experience their health and well-being in ways that help both their life in general, but their work specifically. So before COVID-19, we were in the health crisis. We were concerned about how how people were experiencing work and working conditions that made people sick. So we're looking at a way in which we can create less bad in the workplace and more good. Now came COVID-19, and we are looking at the layering of COVID-19 on top of what people had experienced before. So it's a complicated picture, but I think there is a path through this. And I hope to be able to talk a little bit about not only from a generational point of view, but also for a general working population point of view, what we need to do in order to really create the conditions where people can thrive. So I'm going to toss it over to Drew.
Thanks, Christina. Appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. I'm Drew Jones. I'm a founding partner. Well, first, thanks to Dean and Sven for including me in this wonderful conversation, and a very timely conversation in light of the COVID crisis that we're all navigating together. I'm a founding partner with Open Work Agency. We are a co-working and workplace strategy consultancy in Austin, Texas. I'm trained as an anthropologist, and that's kind of the perspective I have in my work, though prior to becoming a workplace geek, I was a business school professor for 15 years where I taught organizational behavior and leadership and corporate strategy, and was the co-owner of a first co-working space in Austin going back to 2007. And Open Work Agency really was an extension of our co-working space, and we've built that into a consultancy, primarily helping real estate developers around the world convert some portion of their portfolio to shared workspace. But more recently, working with companies that are beginning to incorporate some of the sort of cultural principles of co-working, choice, flexibility, agency, some of these things which mirror the types of work that you see in activity-based working. So we're becoming more of a corporate-focused agency as well. And so really my interests lie in the evolution of choice and flexibility and how that plays out across the different generations, which I see as really a fascinating area, both for writing, which I continue to do quite a bit of writing, but mostly in the context of our consulting work. So Dean, back over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Let me get my computer unstuck here. So my name is Dean Strombom, and I'm with Gensler. And before we start with questions to our panelists, I thought I'd set up the conversation with some recent research that we've been conducting, beginning with a couple of slides here from a national working from home survey that Gensler deployed just a few weeks ago. And it's specific, in this particular section, these slides are specific to generational differences. So when you look at this, at least it's surprising to me that older workers are more likely to feel accomplished at the end of the day while working at home, and younger workers feel more stressed and report and report getting less work done. So when I first saw these questions, I thought it would be pretty much just the opposite. You see on the left side of the screen, the question, I feel like I've made a difference, baby boomers at the top and Gen Z and millennials at the bottom. And similarly, questions like I feel like I've accomplished the work I need to do and I know what is expected of me, baby boomers come out on top of that. And then at the same time, you see the younger generations feeling more stressed while working at home, and compared to the office, getting less work done at home. So a little bit surprising, I think. Similarly, millennials and Gen Z workers are finding it hard to maintain their work-life balance and avoiding distractions. Again, this was sort of counterintuitive, at least in my mind, that you see these graphs here and baby boomers working at home appear, at least from the results of this survey, that they are actually able to avoid distractions at home easier than other generations, as well as maintaining this work-life balance. So that's working at home. So in preparation specifically for this presentation, Sven and I did a quick and dirty survey of about 150 people just to gauge generational expectations of the workplace as we begin to return to the work. So again, it's not a huge population in this survey, but I think it's indicative of how people are beginning to see coming back to work. And what we found is that at both ends of the spectrum, the boomers and Generation Z tend to be more excited about returning to work. They're also feeling more comfortable with the idea of working in a focused work mode, as well as meeting with others in the office. But when you ask them if you'd rather have a assigned seat or be more agile, it's the boomers and the Generation Z that would like most to have an assigned seat. On the other side, the Xers and millennials tend to be less excited to return to work, less comfortable with the idea of working and meeting in the office, but substantially more interested in an agile work environment with multiple settings that they can move to for specific tasks. Surprising, again, to me at least, comfort with technology is pretty strong, again, among all four of these generations. But as you would expect, boomers are a little less than others. Gen Z is the most comfortable with technology. And then one of the last questions we asked was, now that people have had a chance to work at home, when you come back to work, how much of your week would you like to spend outside the office? Not necessarily working at home, but just working remote from your physical office space. And across the board, all generations in our survey said about 2.5 days per week. So half their time they'd like to be away from the office. So I just thought that was some interesting results there. So now we'll go on to the questions to our panelists, beginning with Scott. So Scott, how is Salesforce thinking about re-entering the workplace? I know you've been working hard at that for the last several weeks. And are you seeing any generational differences as you build this program?
Yeah, thanks, Dean, and interesting information as you share the data there. As I think about Salesforce, a response to returning to the workplace, I think back to March and when we started that effort, we took a very structured approach from a business continuity plan standpoint, looking at, who needs to come back first and, the business processes that need to be supported. And as a technology company, as you can imagine, we put our technology development teams to the task, and we developed a tool that would allow us to be able to do that in a systematic way. I think what we learned very quickly as we started to gain a little more experience, as we started to survey our employees who are now all working from home and all remote, what we found is that the return to workplace discussion really became more about an employee engagement and less about business continuity plans. As we learned, an example from our finance team, for instance, as we finished March, and they experienced for the first time a remote financial close. As we finished April, and they closed a quarter for the first time without anybody being physically together, we very quickly learned that the ability to complete those business processes were less of a driver than the employee engagement piece in the return to workplace. And so as we've gone through the surveying process, we have on a monthly basis have reached out to our employees and continue to gauge, what is their level of interest. First of all, how are they doing? How are they surviving? Are they being productive? Do they feel as though they are in a place where they're still contributing? And then beyond that, how likely are they to return to the office when they have an opportunity to do so? And one of the interesting things that we found was when we surveyed in April, we were over 50% positive in response to I would likely or very likely return to the workplace at the first opportunity. And as we extended that into May and we surveyed the same information, we saw about a 12% drop in those that were interested in coming back quickly. And as we started to dig into that data and working with our employee success team on the HR side, one of the things that we found is it definitely started to divide into generational differences. There were some functional differences, but very clearly some generational differences. And when we looked at that in detail, some of the things that we found as employees were able to offer some additional comments around clarifying their responses. The generational differences really fell to the millennials and the Gen Zs as far as those being more interested in getting back to the office sooner. And as we dug into that, really kind of three reasons for that started to float to the top. And one of those just very simply being their kind of position in life from a home standpoint, the effectiveness of their work home settings, in some cases, very small apartments with roommates and the difficulty of engaging in work from that standpoint. And then interestingly enough, we found that the professional development context that work from home was providing as we have new employees coming into the company was a challenge for them. And then also the social aspect. And for the generations there, work becomes a social component as well. And so, effectiveness, professional development, the social aspect, those are all considerations certainly for those generations on the millennial and Gen Z side for return to work that we're absolutely considering.
Okay. Christina, a couple questions for you. So what do we need to understand about the different generations in order to adequately respond to their needs now and in the future?
Well, that's a great question. And actually it speaks to what you presented, Dean, and also Scott, what you learned from your questioning. And the issue here is what are the differences across the generations that are meaningful? And I think we need to understand a couple of things. One is that these generations are different in terms of maturation, their life cycle. And so our youngest generations are experiencing things differently from the older generations. And so family responsibility is very much key. The area of, sorry, I'm getting feedback. Is that coming across there too?
A little bit.
Yeah. Let me see if I can plug in some earphones. That might help. So in terms of the middle generations that we're talking about, we have problems with taking care of kids, and that's a big issue. For boomers, their kids have left the nest, and they will be living alone or with fewer distractions. With Gen Zs and millennials, they may or may not have any family responsibilities, and so they're anxious to get their careers kicked off. So it makes sense what you're both reporting in terms of what is important to these generations. Secondly, social networking is the way people interact for the youngest generations. And it's less comfortable for baby boomers. They'd rather have in person. So returning to work is important for boomers if it's safe, if they perceive it's going to be safe, and for the Gen Zs, because social interaction is their lifeblood. And it's very important that they have an opportunity to meet with people in person so that they can grow professionally and also develop those relationships. So tech savvy is another factor that's important to understand, how well people can deal with their work through technology. Again, the youngest generations, Gen Zs, millennials, it's fully integrated into their life. And especially when we talk about the introduction of AI, that might go into augmented reality and virtual reality, they feel much more comfortable with these kinds of tools, and the oldest generation is less comfortable. So, you know, there are a lot of implications here in terms of what they're comfortable with, what they're used to, their life experience, and what is happening in their lives, which will color their feelings about working remotely, and it will color their eagerness to get back to the workplace. So I would say, Dean, even though this was counterintuitive, it's perfectly consistent with
your own research,
what we're seeing. And Scott, the fact that you have figured out that engagement is really the key thing here. How can we engage the workers again and maintain their ability to perform, but also to have that social safety net for them? But it's going to look different. It's going to be required differently for these different generations, because the bottom line here, where I'm coming from, is that every human being has basic human needs. And those basic human needs are important to satisfy in order for people to have a sense of well-being. So different needs will be most relevant for different generations. And unless we take that into account, we'll have people who will be stressed because they won't get what they need and reluctant to come back to the workplace unless it provides it. So I'll end it there.
All right, thank you. Drew, let's just turn to you and talk to us a little bit about this notion of generation flux, which is a relatively new concept that has become popular since being featured in Fast Company magazine.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. Well, you know, while I do, you know, where one is in the life course clearly has a huge impact on experience, particularly like point that some of the attendees are making about having children at home and how that impacts your ability to focus at home when you've got all sorts of things going on. Also, the pivotal events in a generation. You think of, you know, traditionals living in the shadow of the greatest generation, boomers, all that boomers accomplished in terms of civil rights, voting rights, war protests. I mean, boomers literally changed the world, and so on through the generations. So there are these substantive differences. There's no question about that. At the same time, though, I think that within each generation, there are, as Robert Safran, the author of that series of articles in Fast Company on Genflux, wrote, there are certain shared values. I would say they really are, from my point of view, sort of the cultural values of the sharing economy, the difference between a proprietary mindset versus an open source mindset, much of which really comes out of the Bay Area and companies like Salesforce. But Genflux being this acceptance of whether you're 60 or 30, whatever technical generation you're in, Genflux being a state of mind, what Safin called a psychographic as opposed to a demographic, where you share certain acceptance of change being constant. Things like in the workplace discussion, corner offices, fixed state workstations, and these sorts of things being perhaps more of a kind of proprietary extension, part of a proprietary point of view, and Genflux being more open to change and more willing to ride the waves of uncertainty, and that pertains to how decisions are made with respect to innovation, of course, and if you're going to embrace design thinking and innovation, there's a certain amount of things you can't know. You have to experiment and you have to iterate, and these are the sort of core principles of the Genflux point of view, and I see that in people of all ages. So it's also a way sort of to unify people as opposed to dividing people around these differences. And I think in a way, for me, in the work that we do, Genflux is sort of our template for the design vision that we see, where you try to accommodate everybody, but there is a point of view there, and it's maximum choice, flexibility. It really comes together around the principles of activity-based working, and choice and flexibility, and those sorts of things.
So I know when we talk about designing workplaces, and it almost seems like we're focusing perhaps too much on differences between generations, which could really complicate a workplace if you actually tried to divvy up the place for different aspects of generations' behavior. So maybe this Genflux is more appropriate as a starting point for designing rather than designing for individual generations.
If I can jump in here, I think it's both the space, but it's also resources. That what we want in the same building, perhaps, or site, is options that address the needs of the people in that space. And maybe generationally, there'll be trends, because I think there are some real trends as we have been studying, but also the issue is, how can you create a workplace that will meet the needs of individuals in that space? And it's both multiple spaces, but it's also multiple ways of doing your work. Okay. So Drew, I think you make really good points there.
Well, I know that, Christina, you do a lot of work when it comes to culture. I wanted to ask Scott specifically about the Salesforce culture and how your company's culture influences generational thinking about the design of the workplace.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we are certainly most proud of at Salesforce is the culture that we've established with the company. And, we very regularly talk about the values that are a part of that culture. And I believe, and we see it in, the interviews with our employees, the reasons that our employees are choosing Salesforce for their careers, a lot of times hinges on the importance of those values from a company standpoint. So two of those really core values for us are trust and equality. And when we think about how those apply to the workplace and how we apply those from a design standpoint, and coming back to this notion that was just being talked about by Drew and Christina around choices, the ability to create the right choices that not only correspond to the job function, but correspond to all of the different different generations that respond to the different personality types, introvert, extrovert. That's the level of choice that, as we look at design in the workplace, creating that trust, reinforcing that notion of equality in the workplace, we are looking at, further expanding as we think about return to the workplace and what that means from a design standpoint. We're looking at how do we further expand the level of choice. And again, going back to that question of how do we create a compelling reason for people to want to come back into the office, the choice is a big factor in that.
Yeah, Scott, on that, you mentioned previously that roughly 60% of employees are addressless. Is that right? So you guys are already working in that fluid way, right?
That's correct. And we are starting to see what is developing as really kind of three primary categories of employee. One is the work from home employee base that was about 8 to 10% of our population previously. And then we know that there will continue to be a percentage of our employees who will need to come to the office on a regular basis. But the greater majority of our employees start to fall into this category that we're calling a flex employee. And, that's a range of anywhere from come to the office a couple times a month to maybe it's, per the data that Dean was sharing, a couple of times a week. And so, we're planning and designing and thinking in terms of, how do we accommodate that, that huge category of employee now that's going to be in this flex category. And certainly the shared seating model is one that we feel is going to allow us to be able to create even more of that choice in the workplace as we go forward.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to have such a big group that wants to be flex. And, have we dug into why they want to be flex, like why part home, part back in the office? Do you have any clues as to why they're saying that, Scott?
Yeah, I think some of it is being able to create more of a work-life balance, and certainly for a lot of our folks that are in headquarters in San Francisco, long commute times, that coupled now with the safety aspect. And, while we can do, everything that we can do around the safety and creating confidence in our employees returning in the office, it's that commute that we oftentimes hear is the biggest challenge of getting on BART in the Bay Area or getting on the subway in New York, and work-life balance of safety, of all of those things that help to create the desire to work from home. And then what has proofed out over the last several months is the fact that, that as an organization, we can be productive in doing that. In fact, we found that our development teams, while they had a dip during the end of first quarter and in late March, early April, we found that the development team were right back up to the same level of productivity by mid-March or by mid-April. In being able to work from home.
Yeah, and one of the things we found in our research is that the distractions at work really harmed people's ability to be productive. So I imagine having control over their time and being able to cut out distractions if the children go to daycare or there's some kind of process for handling, the dogs, the cats, the kids, the parents, the roommates. If there's a way to arrange that so that they can be at home and working effectively, that's really a good choice. But it also speaks to the value of WeWorks and other flex workplaces that are near where people live, so you cut down the commuting. So Drew, I know you've talked a lot about that in terms of how the flex space might be involved in that.
Yeah, well, what we're seeing, similar to what Scott's describing, is what we refer to as the extensible office, where going forward, people will work from one of 4 nodes, either at the office, at home, maybe at a co-working space part of the time, and perhaps like a lot of people, coffee shops. Once we're comfortable being around other people again, the coffee shops, we used to say this in the early days, but Starbucks is the largest co-working operator in the world. They just sell their memberships 1 cappuccino at a time. The number of millions of people that are on their laptops jamming away at work every day, weekday, makes WeWork look like a tiny startup. So all of those would be viable. I think what's really interesting from our perspective is how this is starting to, especially when Scott describes the 3 categories. We're working on a process now, a software to create. It's almost like the way we're looking at it is how do corporate employees access their office the way co-working members do. So we've come up with this sort of a typology that kind of mirrors what Scott's talking about. We call campers, that are people that'll be there all the time, explorers that'll be there part of the time, and nomads that'll be there infrequently. And then letting employees opt into that, like they would sign up for a co-working membership, and that'd give them a certain access and permission to the campus, and then check in when they're there so that the data can be collected about usage, as part of a real estate strategy, but also as a gesture of choice to employees, and let people work where they work most effectively. So I really love what's happening at Salesforce, because it's what we've been cooking up sort of post-COVID as a way to re-enter. So that's really exciting.
So Drew, following up on that, we know through our research, Christina's research, and others, that younger staff wants to be back in the office, at least for one reason, to ensure a career path and recognition that they are making strong contributions and sort of be seen. I'm just wondering, how do we design spaces where this younger staff have more frequent and meaningful interactions with senior leadership?
Well, I think this, and I tend to be a one-hit wonder in terms of my response to these questions, but I think, activity-based working really is central to this. And, it's kind of a scratchy and sort of social science thing to say, but let's face it, hierarchy in companies is inscribed into design, and it's rare that younger staff get a chance to spend time, informal mentoring, impromptu chats, learning from senior people, because they're sequestered in wherever they are, with separated a couple levels of PAs, and then in other more full-on activity-based environments, particularly in Europe and Australasia, CEOs and other senior staff work in the same environments as everybody else. So there's a democratization effect that takes place there that is really what millennials and Gen Z want. It's annoying to senior people because that's sort of an expectation of access and input that older generations didn't have. So if I wasn't allowed to do that, then why should you be able to sit with the CEO? But here we are, and it's almost becoming a hygiene factor. Some of these things that used to be radical are now more everyday. And so it's particularly when you look at the data that Scott's talking about, that corroborates the Gensler data about younger people being the ones that want to come back, then it should count when they're there, right? They could do the solo work at home. So I think that having full-on activity-based work, I know that's sort of a radical thing to say, particularly in the U.S., which is more resistant to that culturally than other places. But that's how I would go about trying to address that, is encouraging senior leadership to work more amongst everyday staff than they currently do.
I guess I just have a question to really all the panelists about if people are going to be working in the future in 4 different nodes, and if that's equal, then it's a quarter of the week. how do people actually interact in the office? How do you build those relationships when, if it's just by happenstance, you could never run into the people that you hope to run into at the office just because they may be at that Starbucks or some other coffee shop or working from home. Christina?
This is really the frontier that we have to explore. Social connections are so important. And now that we're all experiencing remote working, most of us, we know what it feels like to be zoomed out every day and be exhausted at the end of the day after a whole string of Zooms or other Microsoft products like GoToMeeting and so on. The idea here is that we are now experiencing only formal communications. We schedule social interactions, and we have completely lost the spontaneous interactions. And we also have the sensation that we won't necessarily be able to talk to the people we really need to talk to on an on-demand basis. So given that, especially Gen Zs needing to form those social connections for the purpose of feeling like they're part of something when they're first entering organizations, we need to figure out how to make a seamless interaction between people remote and the people in the rest of the organization. So I think technology has a huge role to play here, where there could be perhaps open channels that people can join for various purposes. It could be non-work purposes. It could be a restorative channel that people can jump into and just hang out, and kind of like the rest of the break room or the cafeteria in reality. Or it could be, I've heard reported that there's software that allows you to just tap the shoulder of somebody you want to talk to and say, hey, can I ask you a question? And that person will respond. So I think social connection is really what we've lost during this COVID situation, and we really need to think much more innovatively about how we restore that.
Yeah, I think just to jump in on that, I think that from the design professional perspective and for our purposes as workplace strategists, the key is developing an understanding with leadership and organizations of why that's important. And when we talk about our shared seating program, we're talking about that program not as a way to save dollars on real estate costs, but we're talking about in terms of how do we create the equality from a space standpoint to create those types of interactions that are critical for the development of our younger generations in the workplace. And so a lot of my role on the change enablement side is really working with leadership to help them understand the opportunities that workplace and an effective design can really lend itself to in helping to enable that in the organization. Obviously, the key is gaining that leadership support and helping them to understand that that's critical to the success of the organization.
That's a great point. Clearly, Salesforce is doing a tremendous job. I mean, I would go so far as to say in some respects that, design is a reflection of culture. Right? So the spaces that you present to your people embody the values that you have about how you want them to interact. And if you can create environments where people want to be, then they'll show up, and those interactions will be more consistent and reliable. This was the thing that was so amazing to us in the early days of co-working, is now a lot of employees are sponsored by their companies and they go and they work there on a regular basis. But in the early years, nobody had to show up, right? It was totally voluntary. You paid a membership out of your own pocket, and some days you went and some days you didn't, but co-working spaces were full of people who went there by choice. So at the end of the day, the challenge, it seems, is from a leadership and a design perspective for companies, is to create environments where people want to be. And, and so that's not easy to do. Clearly, so excuse me. Clearly, Salesforce is accomplishing that. Many other companies are as well. But it's a real, as Zig Ziglar used to say, it's a real checkup from the neck up about what the corporate values are and how that's reflected in design. And if you can create an environment where particularly younger staff want to be, then you've issues around informal collaboration and innovation. Those things will sort out when people are co-present. Because I agree with Christina that one of the missing pieces here during and post-COVID is roll up your sleeves collaboration. So offices will always be important and central to that going forward, as they always have been. So I think really it's an epical challenge for designers if they can get the green light to do new things, innovative design. I think that COVID will be a real turning point, hopefully, in new era of design.
One business reason to really think about social connections and how you build social cohesion and get people together socially is that the lifeblood of creativity, innovation is spontaneous encounters with people you don't normally work with. And it's just, we have lost that capacity right now because we are talking to people we know. There isn't the virtual water cooler where we can hang out and meet people who are different from ourselves. So there's a long literature out there that says we have to have these chance encounters. And so the question is, how do we bring people back to the workplace, whether it's headquarters, a co-working space, a Starbucks, anything but home where you're working alone, where we can create these spontaneous encounters. And we might find that a year or two down the road, the innovation has really suffered.
I know we want to leave just a few minutes for questions anyway, and we've got a bunch of them. So let me just end with the formal part of this with one question for each of you, and that is, what is one thing you personally have learned from working from home that may be true for others? Just a sentence or two. Scott, how about you? Working from home?
Yeah, I think that what Christina hit on is it's been key for me, and I'm based in Chicago. A lot of my team is obviously in San Francisco at our headquarters. So even prior to COVID, we dealt with that a little bit, but just the ability to have that casual interaction, that conversation that happens, the 5 minutes after a meeting occurs, a formal meeting breaks up. That is beneficial in answering the pressing question in mind and getting to decisions that you need to move forward. So, I think that, that for me has been, one of those challenges in not being able to be face to face. And to that end, and Christina also talked about innovation, I think as much as the pandemic and the impacts of coming out of that will affect workplace design, I think technology and innovation will be a huge component of that also. So how do we think in terms of creating technology that will allow for more of that impromptu, quick, fast decision making that's a product of being able to be face to face?
Okay. Drew, what have you learned about working from home? Not all that unusual for you, though.
Well, I tend to work at co-working spaces and at home or on client sites, so I don't typically go into an HQ of any sort with open work, but local co-working space being our HQ. But really, I've just been shocked by how much we can do with these digital tools. I mean, we always travel to client site, do site visits, get to know the team, and all of that. But we're managing to do what we need to do from home, and it's I think it's this, for me, it's this realization of how robust and effective so many of these digital tools are, and I knew they were around, whether it's Mural or Zoom or Asana and all these things in Slack, but now really using them, it's like they're really paying off, and it's it makes me wonder, about going forward, how much business travel clients will want to pay for, and how much they, so the cost savings that I think will come from these technologies, that really has hit me.
Christina, what have you learned?
All right, so what I've learned is I really need to visit with people in person. And I thrive on interacting with people who are different from me, because as an interdisciplinary center, that's the point. And so what has occurred to me is that we really have to figure out how to make personal protective equipment attractive, so that people will want to wear it. And if they wear it, they can go anywhere and interact with anyone. So I want to put out a challenge to folks out in the business world to come up with designer PPE and luxury brand stuff so that it becomes a fashion statement.
That's good. And so that leads right into the questions. We've got time to address a few of these that have come in, and several of them around how do you balance shared workspaces with health and safety given the pandemic. Some questions specifically to Scott about work, about Salesforce. How are you dealing with the health issues of assuring people coming back to the office, and maybe it's through designer PPE. But Scott, do you want to take a stab at what Salesforce is doing in regard to the COVID side and the concern about coming back?
Yeah, so I think the health and safety side is one that we've spent a ton of time talking through, and that's certainly a priority of ours as we return to the workplace. And without question, shared seating models don't work without significantly enhanced cleaning protocols. And so, not only enhancing those protocols, but making them more visible. So employees see them, they see that they are enhanced, that there is more going on than that maybe they've seen in the past. And so from that standpoint, our focus is split between making sure that those protocols are in place, but then also as we think about returning to the workplace, the ability to do that in a flexible manner, as we think in terms of larger buildings, we're reactivating certain floors as opposed to the entire building at one time. And so that having that flexibility from a seating model standpoint allows us to be able to do that. And then, as we think about, further out in the future and what the workplace begins to look like and needs to look like after a vaccine. And so we think about this notion of flex employees and the desire for employees to come to the office maybe less or for very targeted purposes. And so the shared seating model really starts to enable that design thinking much more than an assigned workspace has in the past.
Okay. One of the questions is about women in particular that are having to deal with children as they work remotely, and not just as they work remotely. And so the question is, how will they be affected in terms of promotion if they need a more flexible work schedule? Anybody want to take that one?
Okay, the representative woman and the panel.
It seems what most appropriate.
Yeah, promotion is all about performance and commitment and showing potential, and it's an age-old problem for women trying to climb the ladder when they're raising a family at the same time. To the extent the parenting duties are not shared evenly, or let's just say just having parenting duties, whether it's children or elderly parents that you're taking care of. So it's a policy, it's an organizational policy question that needs to address flexibility in evaluation of one's career and contribution. And if there are more supports built into the organizational practices that allows women to contribute in ways that is compatible with their parenting responsibilities, I think we'll have greater gains in that respect. But one thing you cannot get away from is that women are the ones who bear the children. So there is an unequal experience between men and women in that regard. But we must recognize the contribution that women can make when they're coming from a different circumstance.
All right. Well, we are right up at the top of the hour, so let's just close this out.
So let me just do a very quick closing with this. I think one of the things that we've talked about is the pivotal point is around choice. And when the company's ready for us to come back to work and we're ready, there doesn't seem to be any issues. But if we're not ready and the company's ready, or the company's not ready and we're ready, this is where across generations, there's a lot more robust conversation that I think could really happen. I think this has really been interesting. And Dean and I want to thank our panelists for the discussion today. They've given us a lot to think about. And we know there's going to be further debates with respect to multiple generations. Every day we learn a little more, and hope everyone listening to this panel will work together to help find common ground to confront the current crisis. One thing we know is this isn't the first crisis we have faced, and it certainly won't be the last. Some smaller and some potentially larger. As long as there are conversations to have and connections to be made, then we'll find ourselves working together successfully on a common cause. Should you have any further questions or want to know more about how we're moving forward in solution, our contact information is on the screen. So all the best to all of you on behalf of Dean, Scott, Christina, Drew, and myself. Have a great rest of the day. Monica?
Wow, thank you. Sven, Dean, Scott, Christina, and Drew, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. We really appreciate this very powerful and timely presentation. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today. Please join us tomorrow for the next level of physical space. Have a great day and be well. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.